Our guests today are Brian Breheny of Skadden Arps in Washington, D.C., Candace Jackson of Mayor Brown in Chicago, Sarah Fortt of Vinson and Elkins in Austin, and Keir Gumbs of Uber in D.C. and in San Francisco. We're going to talk diversity and inclusion. I'm Brock Romanek. Diversity and inclusion, a topic that rightfully has finally become to the forefront of the world, if not our profession. Probably not enough yet in our profession, and that's a topic for another big guide. But in terms of what public companies should be doing themselves, that's our topic for today. So Candace, we're going to start with you and talk about what's required by the SEC when it comes to disclosure by companies. And I know you're also going to talk on Nasdaq's recent proposal about board diversity.
Yeah, so the SEC's disclosure requirements on diversity and inclusion with respect to employees really kind of stems from its new disclosure requirement around human capital resources. And so, the SEC, the new rules require a disclosure of any human capital measures or objectives that the company focuses on in managing the business. And so, especially this year, as more and more companies have been publicly, stating their commitment to diversity and inclusion, that they are very focused on diversity and inclusion, that may require disclosure of diversity metrics, diversity measures within the business description of the 10K. So as human capital resources disclosure. So recently, Nasdaq proposed new listing requirements related to board diversity that essentially say that companies are going to be required to have minimal diversity on their boards of directors or explain to their shareholders why they don't. And that's really interesting with Nasdaq getting into the conversation because this has been such a focus by investors over the last several years. And there are a lot of companies that have had really a head start because they have had so much pressure from their investor base to diversify their boards of directors. But there are also companies who have not felt that same pressure from their investors to improve and increase the diversity on their boards. And so, Nasdaq's requirement kind of closes that gap and is going to really require those companies who haven't felt that pressure to actually implement changes to their recruiting process and to, add diverse directors to their boards of directors or to affirmatively explain to their investors why they have not. So I think, you're definitely seeing the tides change when it comes to diversity disclosure. The new rules also require specific disclosure about the diversity metrics, the diversity makeup of the board of directors. And so, they really want to standardize the disclosure of those metrics. So you're really seeing the tide start to change when it comes to diversity disclosure.
And Keir, I know that you've been involved in your shareholder engagement efforts recently at Uber, and also you were on the panel about shareholder engagement that we just taped a few days ago. What kind of conversations are you having with investors when it comes to D&I in terms of what disclosures they're looking for?
Sure, and glad to be here, and thanks, Brock, as always, for the invitation. It is a topic that comes up in every single investor engagement that we have in some form or fashion. I think some of that is tied to Uber's history and some of the challenges we've had around diversity and inclusion, particularly with respect to gender. And so it's something that for the investors that have been invested in us for a long time, they want to know what kind of progress we've made over the last 3 or 4 years with respect to diversity and inclusion. There are a number of specific metrics and data points that investors are looking for. All of these conversations start with information about the board of directors. And so investors always want to know, tell us about your board, tell us about the composition of our board. They want to understand what kinds of consideration diversity and inclusion has played as we've selected board members. So that's one data point that we have included in our proxy and as a standard in our engagements. They want to understand the board composition from an EEO perspective. And so if you look at our proxy last year or ESG report, it includes both gender information as well as pictures, which can be helpful on top of information about the ethnicity of our directors. One new thing that we're going to be exploring for 2021 at the request of investors is adding a diversity-related matrix for our board of directors that's similar to the skills matrix that many companies have historically produced, including Uber, with respect to their board. And so you can imagine the graphic where you've got each director, and then you've got a list of different types of diversity, from different types of ethnic diversity, gender, et cetera, and presenting that in the proxy in a graphical way so that investors can kind of see how your directors have self-identified. And so that'll be a new data point that we're looking to provide in 2021. But then investors are also very interested in the workplace, in our workforce. And about the composition of our workforce from a diversity perspective, trends in diversity for our workforce. So we just put out a diversity report about 2 weeks ago, and that included historical information about our workforce, both focusing on organization, so the tech organization versus non-tech. It looked at it globally. It sliced and diced things based on leadership roles versus non-leadership roles. Investors have asked us to supplement that kind of information with intersectional information. So instead of using the basic men, women, ethnicity, also looking at it more complex, in a more complex fashion. So within women at Uber, for example, how many women fall into each different ethnic bucket, for example. And so all of those are the kinds of data points that investors are looking for. And then the last one that I'll mention is I think comparability is a real challenge for investors as they're looking at public companies. And so one way that investors are looking to increase the comparability of diversity data is getting standardized information from companies with respect to diversity. And so in particular, we've been asked by a number of investors to provide them with the EEO-1 data that us, like many other companies, have to provide to the government, so that they can take that data and compare apples to apples as they're looking at the overall workforce performance for diversity. And Brock, there's just one last one, which I neglected to mention, which is pay. Investors are very interested in pay and diversity, and there are two different data points they're looking for there. One is the pay ratio for women versus men at Uber, and so that's something that we just provided in our diversity report. And then the second thing is underrepresented minorities versus the rest of the organization, looking at pay equity. And I'm very proud that this year we announced that there's less than a 1 cent difference between men and women and between underrepresented minorities and other groups at Uber. It was just something that we put in our disclosure at the request of our investors.
Great stuff, Keir. Brian, what about the proxy advisors? ISS and Glass Lewis have now provided their updates for the 2021 proxy season. What are they saying about D&I?
Yeah, and if you follow the trajectory of their policies over the years, they've slowly creeped. And as you pointed out at the top of the video, we're starting to see more interest and likewise ISS and Glass Lewis. So first, thanks for having me. Always good to be with you, Brock. So I'll break it down between ISS and Glass Lewis, and as you just pointed out, they just recently updated their guidelines for the 2021 and some notes about what they intend to do in 2022. So for ISS, for companies in the Russell 3000 or the S&P 1500, they're going to flag in their reports those boards where there's no apparent racial or ethnic diversity. They're going to, when analyzing that, they're only going to give companies credit to the extent that they break it down between gender and the racial and ethnic diversity. In other words, if you aggregate and don't give them that information, they're not going to give you credit for it. And then starting in for meetings in 2022, they're going to recommend against the nominating committee chairs where their board has no apparent racial or ethnic diverse members on the board. So this year, disclosure noted in the reports, and then come in 2022, if you don't have racial and ethnically diverse board members, they're going to recommend against the nominating committee. On gender diversity, which is something they've been focused on already for those companies in the Russell 3000, S&P 1500, they're going to continue to recommend against board chairs where there's an all-male board. And there was a phase-in period for a while. They've done away with it now. So if you have an all-male board, which hopefully you don't, but if you do, the disclosure is not going to help you, unless there's some extenuating circumstance and you can get to ISS to explain it. Glass Lewis also updated for 2021. They're going to continue their policy of voting against nominating committee chairs when there's an all-male board. They're also going to note concerns in their recommendations about boards that only have one female on their board. And then beginning in 2022, Glass Lewis is going to recommend against nominated committee chairs when there's less than 2 women on the board, which, by the way, who knows what will happen with this Nasdaq proposal, but there's a phase-in period in the SEC to approve it, but they're kind of you're starting to see some trends and that's kind of coming together. So the Nasdaq proposal, in my view, is not going to be, it's not going to necessarily it's going to be an important change, but people are starting to do it anyway because of these in voting recommendations. Beginning in 2021, Glass Lewis for companies in the S&P 500 index is also going to include an assessment of the disclosure about the board diversity. They're going to focus on things like percentage of racially and ethnically diverse board members, whether the board has a Rooney Rule in place regarding the initial pool of candidates, the skills disclosure. Again, it's a note at this point, and they're specifically said that for 2021, they're not going to use this disclosure to recommend it, to base their recommendations. However, to the extent that that disclosure assessment triggers something else, it may add to some other things that are going on at the company. So to the extent that your diversity disclosure, in their view, is negative, it's possible they could add that up in something else where they might recommend to get somebody on the board. So that kind of gives you the overview of what we've seen from Glass Lewis and ISS.
Great stuff. So Sarah, so when a company's grappling with providing this kind of disclosure for the first time, what sort of questions should they be asking so that their disclosure is sort of not a parade of horribles, that there is some sort of story to tell, at least at the ground floor level, if not something better?
So I think I have 5 quick points, and beginning with the word that you used, Brock, story, and to highlight some of what Keir was talking about. I think you have to start by asking yourself, what's the story that you want to tell? Part of that might be informed by your investor engagement efforts. Part of it might be informed by other stakeholder engagement. But what's the story that you want to tell, and what's the story that you can tell consistently? Because once you put this disclosure out there, people are going to expect you to continue to speak to the same data points. So that's important. The second item is data. So where does the information lie in the organization, and how can it be verified? This can require, for some companies, quite a bit of digging. And so building in that time to really understand where your information is and how to verify it is important. The third would be team. So a lot of times disclosure like this, and in particular other areas of ESG, which I know you're doing videos on as well, requires people across the organization to work together to build the story. And sometimes those are people who don't traditionally speak the same corporate language. So getting your team members on the same page with respect to both the scope of the information that you'll be disclosing and the why behind the disclosure is really important. The fourth would be consistency. So one of the things that we've seen, and I know we've discussed, Brock, is that companies build this beautiful diversity, equity, and inclusion disclosure and don't consider how the message may play into other aspects of their corporate voice, whether that's their branding and marketing efforts, whether that's litigation that they've been subject to. So just understanding how that story fits into the overall corporate story is really important. And then last, time for review. And in particular, I think it is important to have your disclosure experts, your governance experts, your labor experts have time to consider what it is that you're putting out there into the marketplace.
Yeah, to have a good story, it has to be part of your strategy. It has to be part of the group think, the tone at the top. And you've been writing such great pieces, such great thought leadership pieces on this area. And of course, we have taped some other big guides on it. So great stuff. And I love, I'm going to be reaching out to you to actually publish in the Corporate Governance Advisor one of those pieces that you just wrote. Brian, what about the frameworks, the standards out there that folks can look to get ideas? Keir mentioned one, but there are others?
Yeah, this, by the way, is the million-dollar question. I mean, boy, when I was back at the SEC, an investor advisory committee that Mayor Shapiro set up, that group was making recommendations for SEC frameworks for many things, ESG related, including diversity. And here we are, 10, 12 years later. And by the way, the Investment Advisory Committee, the new one, the current one, made recommendations similar this week. So what we'll see in the Biden administration from the SEC, I don't know, although I suspect there will be some focus on the ESG. In the meanwhile, we have this human capital requirement in the 10K, which Candace talked about earlier, and it's principles based, and lots of people with a blank piece of paper are thinking like, well, what do I say? Thankfully for us, but not for those companies, there's some companies who had to file 10Ks because they're not on a calendar year. So we get to see some examples of what they're including. So framework, Nasdaq, as Candace mentioned in their proposal, there's a two-part, it's a tell us about your diverse boards, but also give us a sort of a matrix. And the New York City Controller's Office, I think, was leading that charge for a while. Keir mentioned that they looked at that. I think that's a helpful metric to look at. It's one that Nasdaq kind of picked up on. It doesn't require you to specifically identify who is the diverse person on the board. It allows for aggregate reporting, which can be an issue. At least people thought it was an issue. It also went through the typical shareholder proposal process where it started out and it got shot down in negotiations. And so I think we're in a sort of, 2.0, maybe 3.0. So I think if you look at those as an example with regards to diversity, there's some out there. More broadly, as you know, there are all sorts of standards kicking around, right? There's the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, which is broader than just diversity or board diversity. And then there's the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So companies are starting to look at those as well. They're helpful. I think what I mentioned earlier, some people, at some point people are going to adopt one or the other, and it's not going to be uniform, which I think is going to potentially be an issue. So if the SEC gets into the game, we'll see if they back a particular horse and which one it will be. But for now, I think there's some examples, and thankfully there's other people who've already done it. So you can look at some precedent.
So Candace, what about the proxy disclosures already out there? What do they look generally, and then where in the proxy might that disclosure best fit, do you think?
Yeah, so I'd say first, considering that the SEC's required disclosure on, employee diversity really, like I said, comes out of that human capital resources disclosure and is something that you would typically find in the 10K. With respect to the human capital resources disclosure, a lot of what we're seeing is more on the qualitative side of the disclosure. So companies are talking about their qualitative objectives around diversity and inclusion. We're not seeing so much quantitative disclosure where you're really seeing statistics around the employee population. There is some, but most of the disclosure is really centered around the qualitative objectives and goals that companies are setting with respect to diversity and inclusion. You also will see this occasionally in the proxy statement in a couple of places. There are companies that are starting to disclose, include ESG report disclosure in their proxy statement. So they may have a section talking about their ESG report, kind of summarizing some of the report findings. You also may see a little bit of ESG report disclosure in the CEO letter or the chairman's letter that's at the beginning of the proxy statement. And occasionally we'll see this disclosure show up in response to shareholder proposals that are requesting that shareholders vote on whether or not the company should produce a diversity report of some sort. And so in the company's response, you'll often see disclosure around the existing diversity and inclusion landscape at the company.
And Keir, what about putting together, you talked about Uber's diversity report. I assume that's not the typical disclosure committee that you would have for your SEC filings. Who gets involved? Like HR, I imagine, and any other subgroups within HR, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a team effort. And so it's definitely led by our diversity and inclusion team that is very, very active in this space. And so they are the owner, so to speak, for the report in terms of, and for these disclosures in terms of generating the data, validating the data, and then thinking about how that data fits into the policies and procedures that they oversee. And then my team comes into play along with the policy team and communications team at Uber, and taking that data and then incorporating it into other documents. So for example, we did include it in our ESG report. We included that kind of information in our proxy last year. I'd expect to do the same next year. And then the communications team is also quite important, because it's one thing to produce the data. It's an entirely different thing to put it out there. You want to make sure that you're communicating with your front foot forward, and making sure that journalists, and in our case, regulators in some instances, and investors all get this data, because it's something that all of those groups are asking for regularly. And then the last part of the process before you put anything out there is you want to make sure that the data is good. And so we work very closely with our internal audit team to validate the data that we put out for example, our ESG report and things like that. And we also make sure that our disclosure committee has an opportunity to see these kinds of disclosures before they go out. Again, just following the typical disclosure controls process that we would for any important disclosure that we're making on behalf of the company.
And then in terms of getting some outside feedback, some third-party feedback, Brian, do you think investors that are particularly interested in this topic should be reviewing a draft of either the disclosure that goes into an SEC filing or maybe a diversity report? Generally, I know for some sustainability reports, sometimes shareholders do get involved on the periphery. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, depends, I guess I'd say, kind of what you're talking about. First, just to be careful, of course, we need to be careful of the proxy rules, right? Because if you're giving something written, it could be viewed as a solicitation. And also Reg FD, to the extent that it's material. Now, perhaps maybe we would, under these facts, we wouldn't necessarily think these statistics are either material. They may already be public, but you just haven't released them. But it could be something I would at least think about it. And to the extent that you're sharing information will eventually be in a proxy statement with an investor, it could be viewed as solicitation. Maybe not. I don't want to be too legalese about it. But anyway, I'll point that out because I would at least think about it before you did it. I don't know that I've seen companies that I've worked with who have handed over sort of like full parts of the report, but certainly they've discussed it. You see it, of course, in shareholder proposals when somebody, a shareholder, is asked for something and you're looking, for instance, to negotiate to get the withdrawal of the proposal. You'll say, okay, I'll include this. But a lot of times that's sort of over the phone, maybe confirmed in an email with, hey, I'll agree to do this, this, and this, but they don't necessarily say this is what the disclosure is. And the reason why I started off it depends is because, it's in my experience, it's rare that anybody who's got the pen on a proxy or a 10K wants to be giving anybody else that opportunity. Get your views. It's up to us to decide. Of course, it's ultimately the board's decision, the disclosure committee. So maybe under certain circumstances, you can see, let me make sure they got it right, because I want to make sure that they're not going to see it and throw up all over it. But I think I'd be careful about it. And I ultimately don't know. Keir would obviously know more than I firsthand, whether you've got somebody in the company who's willing to share certain things. But I would say, perhaps, but under limited circumstances.
So I agree with everything Brian just said. And just, I do think you have to be careful about putting any draft of a document out. You can never take it back once you've put the draft out of anything. And that certainly applies to proxy, ESG, diversity disclosures, whatever it is. And so I think you have to be careful about that. The way that we've managed it, and I'm certain that there are many other potentially better ways to manage it, but the way that we've managed it is we have, as part of our off-season engagement where we're talking about stewardship and ESG and diversity and these sorts of things with investors well in advance of the proxy, we do talk to them about what we're thinking about. The kinds of disclosures we're thinking about, the frameworks we're looking at, the changes we're thinking about making. We try to get as much kind of feedback from investors as we can before we put the information out there, in part because you don't want to spend a lot of time working on a disclosure that no one's going to read or that no one thinks is valuable. And so you definitely, that feedback is super valuable. And at the same time, you don't want to overcommit, because at the end of the day, the board, your executive team, they need to sign off before you formally put something out there. And so there's a little bit of a delicate balance between kind of soliciting that feedback and putting things out too far in advance.
So Sarah, what about disclosures outside of the SEC filings? We've already talked about them a little bit. Southern Edison Company was the first one that I became aware of that was publicly available. Keir, I don't know if you're going to be making your D&I report posted it online, but what do you see, Sarah?
Yeah, so I think it's still an area where we see different types of practice. Quite frankly, probably in response to why the company is making the disclosure to begin with. So, you see website disclosure, you see sections in sustainability or CSR reports, and then among more sophisticated companies, perhaps you do see these separate DE&I reports. I want to touch on something that Brian and Keir touched on, though, and that is, I think as we're starting to see this disclosure in several different places, including proxy statements and other SEC filings, I think companies do need to ask questions around materiality, and they need to ask those questions early. How does this disclosure fit into the company's overall approach to materiality? Is it something that they're simply disclosing because investors are asking for it? Are there aspects of the disclosure that they consider material? And I think being clear about that internally, and even perhaps in the right context, including some disclaimer language, particularly if that kind of disclosure is going to be included in like a 10K or a proxy statement, but it's not viewed as the kind of capital M material. I'd also add that I think as we see trends in the EU and the UK develop around disclosure in this area, we're going to see that bleed across the pond, because companies are going to look at their peer companies, some of whom may be foreign companies, and they're going to compare their practices to their own, and those practices are going to bleed in as well. So I think we're going to continue to see disclosure grow. And in particular, I think, although it's traditionally been that disclosure that lawyers like me have said, keep out of your 10K and your proxy statement. We don't live in that world anymore. And so I think if it's going to be in there, having kind of the right precautions in place and the right reviews in place as well.
And Keir, what about board oversight? Just this morning, I saw a report about how the title of the compensation committee has changed for larger companies in particular, to get away from just calling it the compensation committee. The human capital management is leaking in D&I. So how does that get reflected in board oversight in the comp committee charters or whatever board committee that responsibility lies?
Yeah, it really is a company by company thing. I think it depends entirely on how your company and your board choose to allocate oversight of these kinds of issues. For us, it is a mix of committee and board-wide oversight for diversity and inclusion. I'd say at the highest level, because in part of the place that we're coming from and the commitments we've made over the last 3 or 4 years, the board as a whole is very interested in D&I related issues. And so at every board meeting, for example, we get an update that's included among the pre-reads from our D&I team that gives an update on all of the relevant metrics you can think of, slicing our workforce population globally, domestic, gender, underrepresented minorities, LGBTQ, all of that kind of data is shared with our board on a quarterly basis. But then beyond that, certain committees, and in our case, the compensation committee, has taken specific ownership over human capital. And it's something that we just added to our committee charter for the compensation committee. And that was largely reflective of the fact that something that the comp committee has done over the last few years is really focus on human capital related issues in connection with our executive compensation program. And just to give you an example of that, almost 2 years ago now, we added for the first time, and I think we were among the first companies to do this, added diversity specifically as a performance measure that our senior executive team is compensated on. And so that was something that was initiated by the compensation committee. And so they get regular updates about how the company is performing with respect to those compensation matters. And diversity matters. On top of that, our comp committee focuses on metrics like retention and attrition, as well as offer acceptance, just to measure overall the health of our program and our company as it relates to whether employees are attracted to the company in the first place, whether they're staying, whether they're being promoted, whether they're leaving at high rates. Tech is an incredibly competitive market for talent, and so the compensation committee views it as their responsibility to oversee how we're doing as we're competing for the best talent for within the technology industry.
one more thought actually to add
Okay.
on Sarah's point about materiality. I thought was really interesting, because I think that kind of goes back to, companies that are receiving a lot of pressure from their investor base to have a picture of their policies and their metrics around diversity and inclusion, and those who are not, because maybe they have significant inside ownership, they're controlled companies. If investors are telling you that it's important to them in making their investment decisions to have a clear picture, then it's hard to argue that it's not material. But there are going to be companies who just, it is not important to their investor base, and they don't view it as material. They're not getting pressure to do it. And that's why I really do think it's interesting that Nasdaq has made this a listing requirement, because now they're saying, it doesn't matter if your particular investors are not pushing you to do this, it's important to the market. It's important to investors as a whole. And so you need to either do it or you need to talk about why you don't. And so, I think that's interesting. And I think absent a specific SEC rule that requires it, explicitly, that, those are the type of new, rule requirements and policies that are going to drive more change in this space.
Can I double down on that, Brock?
Yeah.
I think that this is where the action is for not just for diversity, but for really any kind of non-financial metric, ESG related metric, which is how do we decide what things are material and which things aren't? I think so. I can say from our perspective, it comes up every single engagement, every single one. Investors absolutely want to know. However, is that the same as saying that a reasonable investor would base their investment decision on it? That's an open question. It doesn't mean, in my mind, that the SEC shouldn't take action. I think they should, but I think they have to be really careful. And it's not just because of the superficial reasons of it's going to cost more, companies will have to do it. There's actually the risk of liability associated with what companies are disclosing. And you can address some of that through the disclosure committee and making sure that, someone is auditing the information. But at the end of the day, there is, at some point, some court is going to decide whether or not these kinds of disclosures do in fact meet that materiality test. And I don't know what the answer would be. I think our view would be, at this point, it's very important, not sure whether it's something that would actually meet the materiality test, but that remains to be seen how courts and other fora will evaluate that question.
I wonder, when we talk about liability, whether this is the type of disclosure that, you would argue, is materially false or misleading. You know what I mean? Like, it may be material in a sense that, it is becoming important to investors as they're making their investment decisions. But, if the data isn't 100% accurate, is that really materially false or misleading? Are you really going to be subject to liability if you don't get it exactly right? I think, that's.
Can I just, again,
yeah,
down?
Yeah.
There are literally litigation. I mean, look, in the wake of all of the commitments and statements that companies have made following George Floyd around racial equality and equity, there are already lawsuits right now that have been filed against companies that are looking at the statements they've made and comparing them against their progress with respect to diversity internally. And so I think, Candace, this is going to be tested in court in the near term. This is not a long-term theoretical question.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very, very fair point. Very fair
and look,
point.
Regardless of whether it's misleading, ultimately conclude to be misleading, there's tons of litigation where the companies have to spend money and time on, right? So it's there's been some cases on some of these companies in California, the ones that have the diversity, there's claims against companies' boards of not staying on top of certain things with regards to this area. It's, there's companies just spending time and other resources on it.
I would just add, since I apparently opened this can of worms, I do think it's important for companies internally to have a layered approach to materiality. And when I work with companies on their ESG disclosure, whether that's diversity and inclusion related, or whether that is a climate change report, one of the first conversations we have is a conversation around their approach to considering materiality, both little m materiality, what is material to the company, little m materiality, I would say what is important to their specific investors, what they're hearing from their specific investors, and then big M materiality, the definition of materiality as accepted by the federal securities laws. So I think having that layered approach and understanding the purpose of that approach, it's not to avoid responsibility. It is to protect the company going forward, however, and to enable them, quite frankly, to make these types of disclosures, to give them the freedom to make these disclosures without terrifying their board members.
Yeah, it's a great conversation. There's obviously training needs to be conducted to those that aren't securities laws experts within the company, so that they're not making statements that the security lawyers in the companies know what kind of communications are going out, and making sure that there's nothing going out that's going to subject the company to real liability. It's a tough area, because as Keir said, there's a lot of shareholder engagement on this topic, as there should be. But the good news is that all this attention is effectuating real change, which is definitely necessary. So thank you very much. This was a wonderful day and a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.